He designs the rings that movie stars argue over. She can't even keep her coffee inside the cup. When the most private man in the jewelry world quietly moves into an ordinary apartment building, the last thing he wants is the cheerful disaster living next door, the woman who has no idea who he is and treats him like the handyman from down the hall. He came here to vanish. Instead, for the first time in years, somebody actually saw him. The cardboard box was not heavy, but Everett Kingsley carried it as if it held something breakable, which it did not. It held 2 sweaters, a coffee grinder, and a bundle of pencils. He climbed the narrow staircase of the Maple Court apartments, one slow step at a time, keeping his face turned toward the wall, the way a man does when he has spent years learning that being recognized is the beginning of a very long afternoon. Nobody recognized him. That was the entire point. 3 days earlier, a ring worth more than the building he was now entering had rolled off a velvet tray during a televised gala, bounced twice, and vanished into a heating vent in front of 40 cameras. It was found an hour later. It was fine. He was not. The clips had been replayed so many times that strangers now greeted him by reenacting his face. So he had told his assistant to find him somewhere small, somewhere ordinary, somewhere with no doorman and no marble, and no one who read the magazines that put him on their covers. Maple Court was all of that. The hallway smelled of someone's slow-cooked dinner. A child's bicycle leaned against a radiator. It was perfect. He had just set the box down to dig for his new key when the door across the hall flew open, as though pushed by a small storm. "Oh, I'm sorry, moving day." The woman came out walking and talking at the same time, balancing a travel mug, a tote bag, and a phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder. "No, not you," she said into the phone. Then to him, "Yes, you. Welcome. Watch the—" She did not finish. The mug tipped. A pale ribbon of coffee arced through the air with a kind of confidence and landed squarely across the front of his coat. For a moment, neither of them moved. "That," she said, lowering the phone, "is a very nice coat." It was. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. "I'll pay for the cleaning," she paused. "I will absolutely not be able to pay for the cleaning. Is it dry clean only?" "It looks dry clean only. It looks like it's never even met a washing machine." Everett looked down at the stains spreading across wool that had, in fact, been made for him by a tailor in Milan. He waited for the irritation to arrive. Strangely, it didn't. There was something disarming about a person apologizing and insulting his coat in the same breath, without a single flicker of recognition in her eyes. "It's only a coat," he said. She squinted at him, as if he'd said something suspicious. "People who own coats like that never say it's only a coat." He had no answer for that. She stuck out the hand that wasn't holding the now empty mug. "Brianna, Caldwell, apartment 4. I talk a lot when I'm nervous, and apparently when I'm not, so you'll want to know that going in." "Everett." He shook her hand. He left off the rest of it, the part that came with a logo. The handshake might have ended there, neat and forgettable, except that the door behind her had quietly swung shut. She turned at the click. She tried the handle. She tried it again with the specific optimism of a person who believes a locked door might change its mind. "Okay," she said slowly. "Small problem. Your key?" "Inside, on the counter, next to the other key, which is also inside." She pressed her forehead to the door. "This is a personal record, and I've only known you 90 seconds. His own key, it turned out, didn't fit her lock, a fact she made him test twice. "Just in case the building likes you better than me." The building manager, a phone call revealed, was at his daughter's recital and would not return until 8. So the famous invisible Everett Kingsley spent his first hour at Maple Court, sitting on the hallway floor beside a woman he'd met by way of a coffee stain, both of them leaning against the wall, waiting. She filled the silence easily, which suited him, because he had spent a great deal of his life being asked to fill it himself. She told him she edited audiobooks, that she had a cat named Pretzel, who was technically not allowed but emotionally essential, that she'd moved here a year ago and still got the hot and cold taps confused. She did not ask what he did. She asked whether he was a hands-on kind of person, because the man in apartment 4 was clearly not, and somebody on this floor ought to be. He considered the word. I work with my hands. See, I knew it. She said it like she'd won something. You've got careful hands. You set that box down like it was full of eggs. He glanced at his own fingers. The small calluses earned over 20 years of holding specialized instruments no one in this hallway would recognize, and felt oddly exposed by the accuracy of it. When the manager finally arrived and let her in, she stood in her open doorway, mug still empty, and looked at him with the frank curiosity of someone deciding whether a stranger was going to be a problem or a pleasure. Listen, careful hands, she said. I have a necklace with a busted clasp. Cheap thing, total junk, but it was my grandmother's. Would you take a look sometime? You seem like the type. The man who had turned down kings, who had a 6-month waiting list and a vault full of commissions, opened his mouth to invent a reason to say no. Sure, he heard himself say. She grinned and shut the door. Everett stood alone in the hallway that smelled of someone else's dinner, holding a stained coat, and realized he had not thought about the ring, the vent, or the cameras in over an hour. It was, he thought, the most peace he'd had in years. He should have been worried about that. He wasn't. The cat arrived before the invitation did. Everett looked up from his workbench on the third morning to find a grey cat sitting in the middle of his kitchen, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, studying him with the unbothered authority of a landlord. The window was open 4 inches. The fire escape outside connected, he now understood, to apartment 4. You must be Pretzel, he said. The cat said nothing and walked directly toward the one thing in the room Everett could not let it touch. He moved faster than a man his size should be able to, scooping the animal up just before it reached the cloth draped over the corner of the bench. Beneath that cloth, in a small, felt-lined tray, lay the beginning of the most important piece of his career, a commission so private that only 3 people in the world knew it existed, and 2 of them were lawyers. He had come to Maple Court partly to hide from the cameras and partly to do this, the slow handwork, in a place where no one would think to look for it. A knock came at the door. He answered it with a cat under one arm. There you are, you traitor. Brianna reached for Pretzel, who melted against her instantly. He does this. He picks a person and just moves in emotionally. Sorry. Did he break anything? He supervised. That's worse. She shifted the cat to her hip and produced from her cardigan pocket a tangle of thin gold chain. Okay, the famous clasp. I know it's nothing. You can absolutely say it's nothing. He took it carefully. It was in fact nothing. A mass-produced piece, the gold so thin it was barely gold at all. The clasp sprung loose from years of being yanked over her head instead of unhooked. But the moment it was in his palm, his whole attention narrowed to it. He couldn't help it. It was the only language he was truly fluent in. Spring rings worn through, he murmured, turning it toward the light from the window. Somebody opened this 1,000 times without using the lever. And this link here is fatigued. See how it's gone oval? It'll fail again in a month if you only fix the clasp. He was already reaching for his smallest pliers before he caught himself. Or so I'd guess. Brianna was looking at him strangely. You'd guess, she repeated. I fix things. You said it yourself. I said you had careful hands. I didn't say you talked about a $4 necklace like a heart surgeon. She tilted her head. Where did a handyman learn the word fatigued? For one weightless second he stood at the edge of telling her. It would have been so simple. My name is on those magazines in the lobby. The ring from the gala, that was mine. He imagined the change in her face, the small distance that always opened the instant people learned what he was worth, the way they started performing around him. Read it somewhere, he said. She didn't believe him. He could tell. But she also, mercifully, didn't push. She set Pretzel down, leaned against his doorframe, and watched him work with an attention that was harder to bear than any camera, because there was nothing behind it but genuine interest. He repaired the clasp in 11 minutes. He could have done it in 4, but he found himself stretching the task, replacing the tired link with a spare from his own stock, smoothing the chain between his fingers. When he handed it back, she clasped it around her own neck without looking, the gesture of someone who'd worn it her whole life. It feels different, she said, surprised. Heavier. Better. She touched the small clasp at the back. What do I owe you? Nothing. Everett. It took 11 minutes. It would have taken me a year and 3 more arguments with the internet. She studied him a moment longer, and something in her expression softened from curiosity into something warmer. something he didn't have a category for. Thank you, really. It's the only thing I have left from her. The simple weight of that landed in the quiet room. He understood it better than she knew. He had built an entire life on the idea that small objects could hold enormous things. A grandmother, a promise, a person you'd lost. It was the one belief he never said out loud to anyone, because in his world, it got translated into prices. It was worth fixing, he said, and meant it about more than the chain. She left. The apartment went still. Everett returned to his bench, lifted the cloth from the felt tray, and looked at the unfinished commission glinting there. Flawless, expensive, watched over by lawyers. Then he looked at the door she'd just walked through and noticed with some discomfort that the cheap necklace had held his attention more completely than the priceless one. That afternoon he heard her through the wall, narrating an audiobook to herself in 3 different voices, getting the villain wrong twice and laughing at her own attempt. He found himself standing very still in the middle of his kitchen, doing nothing, just listening. A small, unfamiliar lightness pressing at the edges of a man who had forgotten what it felt like. By evening, the entire 3rd floor seemed to have heard that the quiet new neighbor was good with his hands. Mrs. Okafor in 6 wanted a picture frame re-glued. The teenager in 2 had a skateboard with a loose truck. Everett, who had once made a tiara for a coronation, found himself kneeling in a stranger's doorway with a screwdriver and being thanked with a plate of cookies. He should have been alarmed at how visible he was becoming. Instead, walking back to his door with a plate of cookies he had not asked for, he caught the sound of Brianna's laughter through the wall again and realized he was no longer trying to disappear quite so hard. "I'm going to be honest with you," Brianna said, standing in his doorway with a flat cardboard box nearly as tall as she was. "This bookshelf has defeated me 3 times. I've named it. Its name is Gerald, and Gerald is winning." Everett looked at the box, then at her. "You want me to fight your furniture? I want you to negotiate with Gerald. I've tried diplomacy. I've tried threats." She held up a small plastic bag. "I have 11 screws and 0 idea where 4 of them go. The instructions are in a language I'm choosing to believe is made up." He should have said no. He had a commission under a cloth and a deadline that did not care about his neighbor's furniture. But she was already backing into her own apartment with the box, certain he would follow, and the strange truth was that he wanted to. Her apartment was the opposite of his in every way. His was bare by design, a bench, a chair, a single lamp, nothing that could be photographed and traced. Hers was a riot of warmth, mismatched mugs, a wall of paperbacks sorted by no system he could detect, a blanket fort that had apparently been built and never taken down. Pretzel watched from atop the refrigerator like a small grey gargoyle. "Sit," she said, gesturing at the floor where Gerald lay in pieces. "Or, you probably want the chair. You seem like a chairperson. I'm fine on the floor." He was not at first. He was a man who had forgotten how to sit on floors, but he lowered himself down, spread the panels out, and felt his hands take over the way they always did. He sorted the screws by size without thinking. He found in under a minute the reason Gerald had defeated her 3 times. She'd been building the frame inside out. "You did the back panel facing forward," he said. "That's a real thing? It's the whole problem." "Gerald," she said to the cardboard, betrayed, "you let me believe in you." They worked. Or rather, he worked and she narrated, handing him pieces, occasionally handing him the wrong piece with great confidence, telling him about the audiobook she was editing, a romance, she admitted, the kind where the leads spent 9 hours refusing to admit the obvious. "It's my favorite genre and it drives me up the wall," she said. "Just say you like each other. It's not that hard." "Isn't it?" He fitted a shelf into its grooves. She paused, a screw between her fingers, pushing a loose strand of light brown hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist. "Spoken like a man who finds it hard." He kept his eyes on the wood. "I find most of it hard. People. The talking part. You're talking to me fine. You don't leave gaps." She laughed at that, delighted, as if he'd handed her a compliment, which, he realized, he had. She did leave a gap then, just one, watching him tighten the last screw, and in the small silence something passed between them that had nothing to do with furniture. When Gerald finally stood, upright and square and faintly miraculous, she clapped both hands over her mouth. "It's beautiful," she breathed. I'm going to put my best books on it, the ones I lie about having read. She turned to him, eyes bright. You're sort of magic, you know that? You just look at broken things and see how they're supposed to be. The phrase caught him somewhere he didn't expect. That was, almost exactly, how he described his own work to the rare person who asked. He'd said it in interviews, in the careful, polished voice he used for cameras. Hearing it back from a woman who didn't know he'd ever held a microphone made it feel new again, and oddly true. Anyone can read instructions, he said. You didn't read the instructions. You threw them across the room. They were wrong. See, that's the magic part. She dropped onto her newly built shelf's bottom rung like it was a bench, testing it, and looked up at him. Can I ask you something and you don't have to answer? His careful instinct woke up. All right. Why'd you really move here? Maple Court isn't where Careful Hands people end up. You've got the coat, the watch you keep turning around so I can't see the face of it. She nodded at his wrist, where he had, without realizing, twisted the dial inward. You're hiding from something. I'm not going to guess what. I just want to know if it's bad. He looked at her for a long moment. The honest answer was a single name and a single profession, and the whole crowded life that came with them. He couldn't give her that yet, but he found he could give her something true. It's not bad, he said. I just needed to be somewhere no one wanted anything from me. She nodded slowly, as if filing it away. Okay, deal. I won't want anything from you. Then, after a beat with a crooked grin, except furniture help and cat sitting. And your opinion on cheese, because I think mine is wrong. Your cheese is wrong, he said before he could stop himself, and her laugh filled the cluttered little apartment and spilled into him, warm and uninvited, the kind of sound he hadn't realized his life had been missing. He walked back across the hall a little later than he'd meant to. Inside his own quiet apartment, the commission waited under its cloth, glittering and important, and watched over by lawyers. He sat at the bench and lifted the corner of the felt. For the first time in his career, he could not make himself care about it. His mind kept drifting back across the hall to a bookshelf named Gerald, and a woman who had promised not to want anything from him, and who had, without knowing it, already asked for the one thing he'd never given anyone, the truth. The laundry room in the basement of Maple Court had 2 working machines, one that ate quarters, and a fluorescent light that buzzed like it had opinions. It was, by any measure, the least romantic room in the building, which made it strange that Everett kept finding reasons to be there at the same time as Brianna. He told himself it was coincidence. His laundry simply happened to be ready when hers was, 3 times in 1 week. The 3rd time, she looked up from folding a tower of brightly colored socks and arched an eyebrow. Are you following me? She said. Or do you just really love this haunted little room? I needed quarters. You always need quarters. She tossed him a roll of them across the room. He caught it without looking. She noticed that he caught it without looking and filed it away the way she filed everything about him lately. Okay, Careful Hands. I actually need your brain. Say it. She'd brought her phone, and on it was a photo of a bracelet. My sister's getting married. I want to give her something good, but I have a budget that laughs at the word good. This is what I can afford. She showed him a thin tennis bracelet, the kind sold in every mall. Is it terrible? Be honest, you're suspiciously honest. He took the phone. And there it was again, that narrowing of his whole self toward the small, bright thing. He couldn't help it. The stones are glued, not set, he said. See the channel? There's no metal holding them, just adhesive. It'll yellow in a year and they'll start dropping out. He zoomed in with 2 fingers. And the clasp is stamped, not cast, so it'll bend the first time she catches it on a sweater. If you want something that lasts, skip the stones entirely. Get her a solid band, even a plain one, in real metal. A thin gold cuff, something with no tricks in it. The tricks are always where these things fail. Brianna stared at him. He realized too late the shape of what he'd just done. A handyman, she said slowly, who knows about set stones versus glued stones, and cast clasps, and channels. I read. If you say you read it somewhere, I'm putting your laundry in the haunted machine. She crossed her arms. Everett, what did you do before you got good at fixing skateboards? He met her eyes. Hers were a clear, surprising blue. He'd noticed it the first day and made himself not notice it since. And right now they were full of a question he couldn't answer, without ending the only easy thing in his life. "I worked in jewelry," he said. It was true. It was a fraction of the truth. Her whole face changed, not with suspicion now, but with delight. "You made jewelry, like actual jewelry." She leaned forward. "Why is that a secret?" "That's the least embarrassing thing a person could possibly do. I edit books about people pretending not to be in love. You make beautiful things out of metal. Own it. It's complicated. Everything's complicated." She waved a sock at him. "But fine. I'll respect the mystery." She tucked the phone away and almost shyly added, "Thank you, though, for real. Nobody's ever sat in a haunted basement and told me the truth about a bracelet." She paused. "Solid band. No tricks." "Got it." Their hands met on the folding table, both reaching for the same fallen sock, a small ordinary collision. They hesitated for a second before moving away. The buzzing light buzzed. Somewhere a dryer thumped to a stop. For a moment, the least romantic room in the building did not feel that way at all, and the only thing Everett could think was how rarely in his whole bright public life anyone had simply wanted his honest opinion and nothing else. She withdrew her hand first. He pretended not to mind that she did. What neither of them knew was that they were being watched. By Friday, the building had a theory. Mrs. Okafor from 6 had seen them in the laundry room, sitting very close, talking very quiet. The teenager in 2 reported that the new guy had fixed his skateboard and then went straight to her door with cookies, which, you know. A consensus formed near the mailboxes with the speed of all good gossip. The quiet, handsome neighbor and the girl from 4. It was only a matter of time. Brianna heard about it from Mrs. Okafor directly, in the elevator, delivered as both blessing and interrogation. "He's a good one," the older woman said, patting her arm. "Quiet ones notice everything. My late husband was a quiet one. Don't let the quiet fool you, they feel the loudest." Then, sharper, "Has he kissed you yet?" "We're neighbors," Brianna said, turning a color she could feel. Said Mrs. Okafor in a tone that contained an entire novel. That night, Brianna sat on Gerald the bookshelf with pretzel in her lap and thought about set stones and glued stones and a man who turned his watch face inward and caught quarters without looking. She thought she should be more careful. She had a rule about mysterious men. The rule was simple: don't. Simple. Across the hall, Everett sat at his bench with the commission uncovered at last. The most important piece of his career laid out in front of him under the single lamp, and found himself reaching instead for a scrap of paper, where he sketched, without quite deciding to, a thin gold cuff, no stones, no tricks, something a person could keep forever. He didn't let himself wonder who it was for. He already knew, and it was too soon to know it. The cupcakes were, objectively, a disaster. They sat on a chipped plate that Brianna held out with both hands, and the desperate pride of a person presenting a gift they already regret. 6 of them. Each one leaned in a different direction, like a tiny crowd that had given up. The frosting had been applied with what Everett could only assume was a trowel. "They're a thank you," she announced, "for Gerald, and the necklace, and the bracelet advice, which saved my sister's wedding and possibly my dignity." She looked down at the plate. "I want you to know I followed the recipe. The recipe and I just have different goals." There, he searched for the word. He had been given gifts by heads of state. He had never been handed anything he wanted more. "They're sincere." That's a word people use for ugly things. "They're sincere," he repeated, and took one and ate it, leaning deliberately against the doorframe so she could watch him do it. It was, in fact, terrible. He finished the whole thing. "More sugar than cake." "I panicked at the sugar stage. I can tell." He took a second one. She watched him eat the second cupcake with an expression he was beginning to recognize and dread, because it was the expression that came right before she saw straight through him. "You don't even like sweet things," she said. "You winced. You're eating them anyway." "I'm being polite." "You're being kind," she corrected. "There's a difference. Polite is for strangers." She didn't finish the thought, but it hung there between them, the unspoken second half of it, and the hallway felt suddenly smaller. To cover the silence, he did something he'd been resisting for days. "Wait here," he said, and went back into his apartment. He returned with a small leather roll, the kind that unfurled to reveal implements so fine they looked like surgical instruments, loupes, gravers, a set of files thinner than matchsticks. He'd told himself he kept them for emergencies. He had no idea what emergency he'd imagined. "Your grandmother's necklace," he said. "The chain's fine now, but the pendant, you said it was bent. Let me see it." She brought it to his bench. She had never been inside his apartment past the doorway, and he watched her take in the bareness of it, the single lamp, the cloth-covered corner she was polite enough not to ask about. She sat on the stool he set out for her close, because the bench was small, and he laid her grandmother's pendant on the felt between them. It was a little oval locket, dented on one side, the hinge stiff with age. He worked on it under the loupe, the magnified world shrinking to gold in his own steady hands. He coaxed the dent out from the inside, freed the hinge, polished the face until the engraving, a tiny pattern of leaves nearly worn away, came back to life. "There were leaves," Brianna whispered, leaning in. "I forgot there were leaves." Her shoulder was against his. Her hand came to rest beside his on the bench, and when he set down the graver, the backs of their fingers touched and stayed touching, both of them looking at the locket and not at each other, both of them aware of nothing else. "It opens," he said quietly. "Did you know it opens?" "It's been stuck my whole life." He pressed the catch he'd just freed. The locket swung open. Inside, behind a clouded oval of glass, was a photograph so old it had gone the color of weak tea, a young woman laughing at someone outside the frame. Brianna made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "That's her," she said. "That's my grandmother. I didn't even know there was a picture in there." She pressed her hand flat against her chest over the empty locket, and when she looked up at him, close enough now to see that his eyes were green, a deep and steady green she somehow hadn't let herself notice before, her own were shining. "You gave me her face back." He had restored crowns. He had repaired heirlooms for families whose names were on buildings. Nothing in 20 years had felt like this, like he'd reached into a small dented thing and pulled out a person someone loved. "I didn't give you anything," he said, his voice low. "It was already in there. It was just waiting for someone careful." She was very close now. The cat had appeared from somewhere and pressed itself against both their ankles, and the single lamp made a warm island of the cluttered bench, and for one suspended moment it would have been the most natural thing in the world to close the small distance between them. Pretzel knocked a file off the bench. It clattered to the floor. The moment broke, the way moments do, into laughter and apology, and both of them reaching for the file and nearly knocking heads. "I should," she said. "Yes. Thank you. Again. I keep saying thank you. You keep giving me cupcakes," he said. "We're even." She left with her grandmother's restored face hanging at her throat. Everett sat alone at the bench afterward, the leather roll still open, the loop still warm from his eye. The commission glinted under its cloth untouched. He looked at the 4 remaining cupcakes she'd left him, leaning in their 4 directions, and felt something he had no schedule for, and no contract for, and absolutely no defense against. He picked up his pencil and added a single line to the sketch of the thin gold cuff, a tiny pattern, almost too small to see. Leaves. Everett Kingsley had eaten meals prepared by chefs on 3 continents. He had never, it turned out, actually cooked one himself. This became clear at 7 in the evening, when the smoke alarm in apartment 3 began to shriek, and Brianna came across the hall without knocking, because by now the not knocking had become its own quiet agreement between them. She found him standing over a pan, holding a wooden spoon, like a man holding a utensil he'd been handed by mistake, surrounded by what had recently been an attempt at dinner. "What is happening?" she said, fanning the alarm with a dish towel until it gave up. "I was making pasta. You were making a crime scene." She peered into the pan. "What is that?" "It was garlic. It's coal." "I looked away," he said, with the wounded dignity of a man who could set a diamond under a microscope but had been defeated by a clove of garlic. "For a second." She started laughing then, and once she started she couldn't stop, leaning against his bare counter, wiping her eyes, while the man who had designed jewelry for royalty stood holding a spoonful of ruined garlic and felt his own composure crack right down the middle. He laughed too. It surprised him, the sound of it, rusty from disuse, like a door in a house no one had lived in for a while. "Sit down," she ordered, taking the spoon to inspect the pan. "Sit. I'm not letting you near open flame again, you menace. You can make beautiful things out of metal and you can't boil water. The universe is so unfair." I never had to learn, he admitted, sitting. Had a personal chef, did you? She teased, and then watched his face, and the teasing faded into something more careful. Wait, did you? He'd said too much again. He always said too much around her. She drew the truth out of him the way she drew stories out of strangers, just by being so genuinely interested that lying felt rude. For a while, he said. It's a long story. You have so many long stories. She found pasta in his cupboard and put a real pot of water on. One day you're going to tell me one of them all the way to the end. One day, he agreed, and the promise frightened him, because he meant it. She cooked. She was not a good cook either, but she was a fearless one, and what she produced was edible and warm and eaten at his bare little table with 2 mismatched forks, because he only owned 2, and they were not a matching pair. She talked the whole time about the romance novel she was narrating, about a character who'd just discovered the love interest had been lying about who he really was for the entire book. Everett's fork paused over his plate. Is she angry? He asked. The woman, when she finds out. Furious and heartbroken, which is worse. Brianna twirled pasta thoughtfully. But here's the thing. She's not angry that he's rich or famous or whatever the big secret is. She's angry that he let her fall for a version of him and never trusted her with the real one, like she wasn't safe enough for the truth. She shrugged. That's the part that gets people, not the lie, the not trusting. He set his fork down very carefully, the way he set down everything, and looked at his plate. What does he do? He said. To fix it. He has to give her the real thing, not an explanation. Anyone can explain. He has to hand her something only the real him could make. She grinned. It's a romance, there's always a grand gesture. So I'm a sucker for a grand gesture, even though I'd never admit it to a single living person. So congratulations, you're now a vault. I'm good at vaults, he said quietly. Later, after she'd gone, after the dishes were done and the smoke had cleared and Pretzel had been carried home protesting, Everett sat at his bench and uncovered the commission for the first time in days. It was magnificent. It was also, he saw now with sudden clarity, lifeless, technically perfect and emotionally empty, the work of a man who had been making things for people he'd never meet, to be worn at events he'd never attend, photographed by cameras he'd grown to dread. He had been the best in the world at making objects that impressed strangers. He had forgotten somewhere along the way how to make something that meant anything. He took out the small sketch of the gold cuff, the one with the leaves, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he took up his finest graver, set a scrap of practice metal on the felt, and began, for the first time in years, to make something for no client, no contract, no camera. Something for a person who had handed him 6 leaning cupcakes and her grandmother's face, and the unbearable gift of seeing him without knowing what he was supposed to be worth. He worked past midnight. The leaves took shape under his hands, tiny and imperfect and alive. He thought about the woman in her audiobook, furious not at the lie, but at the not trusting. He thought about the way Brianna had said, "You're now a vault," and how badly he wanted suddenly to stop being one. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow I'll tell her who I am before she finds out some other way. He believed it when he said it. He even meant it. But across the city, in an office of glass and lawyers, an assistant was confirming a meeting that could not be moved. A client too important to refuse, a delivery too valuable to risk, coming to an address that was supposed to be a secret, coming to Maple Court, coming though no one yet knew it on the worst possible day. The power went out across the whole block on a Tuesday, just after 9, taking the lights, the buzzing laundry room, and the city's usual hum down with it. Maple Court fell into a soft, complete darkness, and for a moment the building held its breath. Then, predictably, there was a knock at Everett's door. Or rather, the absence of one. Brianna simply opened it, the way she did now, a candle in a jam jar lighting her face from below. "Power's out everywhere," she said. "Mrs. Okafor's already organizing the hallway like it's a wartime bunker. I brought you a candle because I had a feeling you owned exactly 0. She looked around his dim apartment, confirmed it, and nodded. Called it. She set the jar on his bench. The small flame steadied, and the bare room turned gold and gentle at the edges, all its hard lines softened. She sat on the stool. He sat in the chair. Outside, the city was a black shape against a blacker sky, and inside there was only the small circle of light and the two of them in it. "It's funny," she said after a while. "I edit stories all day about people whose lives are huge and dramatic, and then the power goes out and the most interesting thing in the world is the guy across the hall who can't cook." She tucked her knees up. "Sorry, that came out weird." "It didn't. It did a little." She turned the jar so the flame leaned. "Can I tell you something embarrassing? It's the candle. Candles make people honest. It's science." "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, the brightness she carried everywhere went thinner, more careful. "I've always been the disaster. The funny one. The one people like having around because I make things lighter, you know. At my old job, my old relationship, everywhere. Brianna, she's a riot. She's so much fun." She traced the rim of the jar. "But nobody ever picks me. Not for the serious stuff. People want me at the party. Nobody wants me for the long version. They think because I drop things and talk too much, I'm not someone you build anything real with." The candle flickered between them. "Anyway," she said, with a laugh that didn't quite work. "That's my embarrassing thing. The disaster has feelings, shocking." Everett did not answer right away. He was a man who'd learned that the wrong words spoken quickly did more damage than silence, and he was thinking with great care about what was true. "The locket," he said finally. "What?" "Your grandmother's locket. The one I opened." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face half in the light. "Do you know why it survived all those years when it got dropped and dented and stuck? Because someone kept it, through everything. Someone decided it was worth carrying even when it was broken." He held her eyes. "The people who only wanted you at the party weren't careless because there was nothing real in you to pick. They were careless because they were careless. That's a fact about them. It was never a fact about you." The hallway noises faded. The candle held its small, steady flame. "You don't even know me that well," she said, but her voice had gone soft. "I know you fixed a bookshelf by building it wrong 3 times and never once decided to quit," he said. "I know you carry a $4 necklace like it's the most valuable thing in the world, and you're right, because it is. I know you made me eat 6 terrible cupcakes and I'd do it again tomorrow." The corner of his mouth moved. "I notice things. It's the one thing I'm genuinely good at, and I've noticed you for weeks now. None of it looks like a disaster to me." She stared at him across the small gold space. This, he understood with sudden vertigo, was the moment. The candlelit, honest, defenseless moment when he should say the rest of it. "And my name is Everett Kingsley, and you've seen me on those magazines in the lobby, and I should have told you weeks ago." The truth was right there in his mouth. He could feel the shape of it. But she spoke first, fast, the way she did when feeling too much. "Okay, wow, the candle is really doing its job. I need to—" "That's a lot of eye contact for a Tuesday." She stood up too quickly, knocking the stool, catching it. "I should check on Mrs. Okafor before she drafts everyone into a search party. Thank you. For the locket thing, for all of it." The moment closed like the locket had been before he freed it. "Brianna." She paused in the doorway, candlelight wavering. He had it right there. 1 sentence. Instead, what came out was smaller and truer and not nearly enough. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'd pick you for the long version." She didn't answer. She just looked at him for one held breath of a second, her face doing something complicated and bright, and then she was gone, the door clicking shut, her footsteps quick down the dark hall. Everett sat alone with the candle she'd left him. He had meant to tell her. He'd had the whole truth loaded and ready, and he'd traded it at the last second for a kindness, because telling her who he was would have ended the candle-lit version of him she liked, and he was not ready, not tonight, to watch the easy way she looked at him turn into the careful way everyone else did. Tomorrow, he promised himself again, he would arrange it. He would bring her here, sit her down in the daylight, and tell her everything before the world told her first. He blew out the candle and sat in the dark a while longer, not knowing that the world had already scheduled its version, that it was coming by appointment, that it would arrive with cameras and security and a name on the boxes, and that it was now less than 2 days away. "They're up to something," Mrs. Okafor announced to the small congregation by the mailboxes. He carried her groceries Monday. She watered his 1 plant Tuesday. You don't water a man's plant unless it's serious. He has a plant, said the teenager from 2. He has a plant now, Mrs. Okafor said darkly. She gave it to him. That's how it starts. Brianna, collecting her mail 2 feet away, turned the precise shade of her own front door and fled up the stairs, while the lobby counsel pretended not to watch her go. She was still flushed when she banged on Everett's door, knocking this time because some things had started to feel too important to barge in on. The whole building thinks we're dating, she said the second he opened it. Mrs. Okafor has a timeline. There's a plant theory. I need air. Come with me. I know a place. The place was the roof. He hadn't known the building had a roof anyone could reach. She did, of course. She knew the propped door and the loose railing, and the one corner where the city laid itself out below in a field of lights. She'd brought a blanket and 2 of the terrible but improving cookies from her latest baking attempt, and she sat on the gravel like it was the most natural throne in the world. "This is mine," she said, gesturing at the skyline. "I come up here when a chapter won't behave. Nobody else bothers." She glanced at him. "You're the first person I've shown." He sat beside her. He who had stood on balconies of buildings he'd helped pay for found this cracked rooftop with its loose railing and its field of ordinary lights to be the finest view he could remember. "Why me?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Because you don't fill the silence. Everyone I know fills it. You just let it be there." She pulled her cardigan tighter. "It's restful." "You're restful." She glanced sideways at him, looking at his profile illuminated by the city lights, and caught herself. Which is a weird thing to be, for a guy who looks like... She stopped. "Like what?" "I'm not going to finish that sentence. The plant theory is enough for one day." He laughed, and she grinned at having made him, and the city glittered below. And there it was again, the thing that kept happening to him, the small private collapse of all his careful distance whenever she turned that open face toward him. He had spent his whole life among people who wanted his name, his work, his money, his proximity to fame. She wanted none of it. She didn't even know it existed. She liked him for being restful, for not filling silences, for eating bad cupcakes, for the man underneath the name. The man he'd almost forgotten was down there. He was, he admitted to himself fully for the first time, completely and hopelessly taken with her. And the cruel, beautiful joke of it was that she could only see him this clearly because she was looking at the wrong man entirely. The moment she learned the right one, the clarity would cloud over. "You went somewhere," she said softly. "Just now, you do that. Your face closes like a shop at the end of the day. I was thinking I should tell you something." She went still. The teasing left her. "Okay." He turned toward her. The lights of the city were in her eyes, and her hand was on the blanket between them, and the distance was small, and he had decided, truly decided, that here, now, on her secret rooftop, he would say the whole of it. He opened his mouth. His phone rang. Not the gentle tone of his personal line, the other one, the one only 3 people had, the one that meant lawyers and contracts and things that could not wait. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. Every instinct conflicted within him at once. "You should get that," she said. "It sounds important. Your face went okay, vault." "It can wait." "Everett." She smiled, but something had shifted behind it. "It really doesn't sound like it can." He stepped to the far corner of the roof and answered low. He thought he was far enough. He was not. She didn't mean to listen, but the wind carried fragments, the way wind does, clipped, urgent words in a voice she'd never heard him use, a flat, commanding tone with all the restful softness gone out of it. The client won't reschedule. No, the location stays. Nobody knows the address, and it stays that way. The piece is finished. I'll have it ready. And then, sharper, final. Make sure the security is discreet. The last thing I need is anyone recognizing me here. He hung up and came back, sliding the warm, easy version of himself on like a coat. "Sorry," he said. "Work." "Sure," she said. But she was watching him differently now, a small new line between her brows, a question she hadn't had before. "Nobody knows the address. Security. Recognizing me." The words sat oddly against the man who couldn't cook and turned his watch face inward. "What were you going to tell me?" she asked. The moment was gone. He could feel it. Whatever he said now would land in the shadow of that phone call, and he could not, would not, hand her his whole truth in a rush of damage control on a rooftop. It deserved better. She deserved better. "It can keep," he said. "Tomorrow, properly, I promise." "You and your tomorrows," she said lightly, but she didn't quite look at him, and she gathered the blanket a little sooner than she might have. They went down the dark stairwell together, not touching, and at her door she paused, and for one moment the warmth came back into her face, the rooftop version of them flickering between them like the candle had. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "I hope it's not bad. I keep telling myself it's not bad." "It's not bad," he said. "It's just late. I should have said it sooner." She nodded slowly, went inside and shut the door. Everett stood in the hall. Tomorrow, he thought. He would tell her tomorrow before the appointment, before the cars and the cameras came. He had it would turn out exactly the wrong number of tomorrows left. He woke before sunrise with the whole speech ready. Everett had rehearsed it in the dark for hours. Plain words, no excuses. "My name is Everett Kingsley. I design jewelry, the kind that ends up in magazines. I came here to hide from a foolish scandal, and then I met you, and being no one to you was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I was a coward not to tell you sooner." He would say it this morning, before anything else, before the day could get its hands on it. He was at her door by 8, coffee in hand as a peace offering, when he heard her voice through the wood, bright, hurried, already on the phone with her sister about the wedding. He waited. He knocked softly. She opened the door with the phone wedged at her shoulder and a suitcase half-packed behind her on the floor. "Hey, sorry. It's chaos. The wedding's been moved up. I'm getting on a train in an hour." She covered the phone. "Is everything okay?" It was not the morning he'd built his speech for. You did not hand a person the truth of your life through a doorway while their sister shouted about seating charts. "Go," he said. "It's not urgent. We'll talk when you're back. You sure? You've got the tomorrow face again. Go to your sister, I'll be here." She smiled, harried and grateful, stepping past him as she left, and was gone in a flurry of suitcase wheels and last-minute panic. He stood holding 2 coffees in the empty hall and told himself it was fine. She'd be back in 2 days. The appointment was tomorrow. She would be hundreds of miles away when the cars came, and he'd tell her the whole story the moment she walked back through that door, on his own terms, the right way. It was a good plan. It survived until noon the next day. The wedding, it emerged through a series of increasingly frantic texts, had been a small one. The seating charts had resolved themselves. And Brianna, having no reason to stay an extra night in a town full of relatives asking why she was still single, changed her ticket and came home a full day early, stepping off the train and into a cab and arriving at Maple Court at precisely the hour Everett had spent 3 weeks of his life trying to keep her away from. She knew something was wrong before she reached the door. There were 2 black cars at the curb, where there were never cars. A man in a dark suit stood by the entrance with the particular stillness of someone being paid to look relaxed. Inside the lobby, the usual congregation by the mailboxes had been gently, firmly cleared. A second man murmured into his cuff as she passed, and his eyes tracked her up the stairs. The 3rd floor was unrecognizable. The hallway smelled of expensive cologne instead of someone's dinner. There were crates stacked outside Everett's open door, sleek black crates stamped on the side with a logo, a crest, a name in fine silver letters that she had walked past 100 times in the lobby on the covers of the magazines nobody on her budget ever bought. Kingsley. She stopped. The suitcase handle went loose in her grip. It didn't make sense, and then it made all the sense in the world, all at once, the way a locket springs open when someone finally finds the catch. The careful hands. The word fatigued. Set stones versus glued stones. "I worked in jewelry." The watch turned inward so she couldn't read the face. "Nobody knows the address. Make sure no one recognizes me here." The man who couldn't cook because he'd never had to learn. The personal chef he'd let slip and tried to swallow back. Not a handyman, not a guy who works with his hands. The Kingsley, the one the whole world waited on. The one whose disappearing ring had been on every screen a month ago. She even remembered the clip now. Remembered laughing at it with a friend. Imagine being that famous and that clumsy, and never once connecting the polished, hunted face on the news to the quiet man next door who ate her terrible cupcakes. He had let her believe he was no one. for weeks. While she sat on a rooftop and confessed the most private fear she had, that nobody ever picked her for the real thing. He had been the realest thing of all, and he had decided she wasn't safe enough to know it. Through the open door, she saw him. He was not the restful man from the candlelight. He stood straight-backed in the center of his bare apartment, which was bare no longer. It was full of lights and stands, and a woman Brianna recognized from actual films, draped in something that caught the light like captured water. He was speaking in that flat, commanding voice from the phone call, gesturing at the piece around the actress's throat, every inch of him precise and untouchable and important. A man in his element. A stranger. He looked up. Across the crowded, glittering room, his eyes found her in the doorway, suitcase in hand, and the whole composed surface of him cracked straight down the middle. "Brianna!" The actress turned. A security man stepped forward. Someone said, "Who is that?" And someone else said, "She's not on the list." Not on the list. She almost laughed. Of course she wasn't. She had never been on any list. She was the disaster from apartment 4 who watered his plant and believed, like an idiot, that she'd been picked. "Brianna, wait." He was moving toward her now, the actress and the lights and the crates forgotten, his face open and stricken and pleading. "Let me explain, please, just give me—" "Don't," she said. It came out very quiet, quieter than anything she'd ever said. And the quiet was worse than shouting, because Everett Kingsley had built his whole life on noticing things, and he heard, in that single word, the exact sound of a locket clicking shut. She turned and walked back down the stairs, past the security and the black crates and the silver letters of his name, and out into the ordinary street where no cars waited for her, and no one ever had. Behind her, in a room full of the most expensive things in the city, the most famous jeweler in the country stood frozen, holding nothing at all. Brianna walked for an hour before she let herself stop. She ended up in a diner 6 blocks from Maple Court, the kind with vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Hon, and she ordered coffee she didn't drink and stared at her grandmother's necklace lying against her collarbone. He'd fixed it. He'd opened the locket and given her back a face she'd lost, with those hands, those famous, careful, lying hands. Her phone buzzed. Everett. She turned it face down, the way he turned his watch. He found her anyway. Of course he did. He noticed things. It was the one thing he was genuinely good at. He'd said so himself on the rooftop, right before he didn't tell her. The bell over the diner door rang and she didn't have to look up to know it was him, because the whole room changed the way rooms changed around him. A little hush, a few heads turning. He slid into the booth across from her without being asked. He'd left the lights and the actress and the crates behind. His tie was gone. He looked for the first time since she'd seen the crest on those crates, like the man from the candlelight again, and somehow that was the worst part. "I never lied to you," he said. "Your name is on crates, Everett. I never said a false thing. I told you I worked in jewelry. I told you it was complicated. Every word I said to you was true." That's the coward's version of honest. She kept her voice low, because the disaster from apartment 4 was not going to make a scene in a diner. "You let me believe something. You let me build a whole—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "You knew exactly what I thought you were, and you let me keep thinking it." "Because the moment people know," he said, and there was something raw under the control now, "it ends. The real conversation ends. They start performing. They want things. You were the only person in years who looked at me and saw a man who couldn't cook instead of a name on a contract. I couldn't—" His jaw tightened. "I couldn't bear to lose that, so I kept it one more day, and then another. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you didn't trust me." The words landed flat and final on the table between them. He flinched. He'd been braced for anger, for the volume she usually carried, and instead she'd reached straight past all of it to the one true thing the way she always did. "On the roof," she went on, quieter still, "I told you the thing I've never told anyone. That nobody picks me for the serious version. That people keep me for the fun and hand the real stuff to somebody steadier." She looked at him, and her eyes were bright and unbearable. "And you sat there. You let me say it. And the whole time you were the proof. You looked at me and decided I was good enough to fix furniture with and eat cupcakes with and confess your candle truths to, but not good enough, not safe enough to know who you actually were." Her voice finally cracked, just once. You did the exact thing I was afraid of. You just did it more thoroughly than anyone ever has. Brianna, I have to go. Please. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. I was going to tell you. This morning. I had it ready, I swear to you. I'd been saying it in the dark all night. And then your sister called in the train, and I was going to tell you the second you got home on my own. He stopped, hearing it. On my own terms. That's the problem, isn't it? It was always going to be on my terms. When I was ready. When it was safe for me. Yeah, she said softly. It was? She slid out of the booth. He didn't stop her this time. He'd learned, an hour too late, that grabbing for a thing was the surest way to break it. She paused beside the table, looking down at him, the most powerful man she'd ever met, sitting in a vinyl booth, looking like the loneliest. For what it's worth, she said, echoing his rooftop words back to him, without meaning to wound and wounding anyway. I didn't fall for the famous one. I never even met him. I fell for the guy who ate 6 terrible cupcakes. She swallowed. I just wish he'd thought I was worth the truth. She left. The bell rang. The room exhaled. Everett sat in the booth a long time after she'd gone. The waitress refilled his coffee and called him Hon and didn't recognize him, and for once it gave him no comfort at all. He understood with the slow clarity he usually reserved for diagnosing the fault in a broken setting exactly where he had gone wrong, and it was not the secret itself. It was that, given the choice between protecting the easy version of himself and trusting her with the real one, he had chosen himself. Every single day. He'd told himself it was to keep her looking at him kindly. It had really been to keep himself safe. She had handed him her deepest fear like a fragile thing across a candle, and he'd held it and nodded and given her nothing real back. Back at Maple Court that evening, the crates were gone. The actress was gone. The hallway smelled of someone's dinner again, ordinary and warm, and the door to apartment 4 stayed shut. He stood outside it for a while. He could hear very faintly the audiobook playing inside, her own recorded voice, doing all the parts, narrating somebody else's love story while she sat alone with her grandmother's necklace. He did not knock. He had used up his right to knock unannounced. That easy thing was gone, and he'd been the one to spend it. Instead, he went into his own apartment, sat at the bench, and lifted the cloth off the corner. Not the commission. The other thing. The small private thing he'd been making by hand for no client and no camera. The thin gold cuff. The band with no tricks in it. The leaves not yet finished. He picked up his finest graver. If he could not give her words, she would believe. He would give her the only language he had never once faked. The one thing only the real him could make. Pretzel kept going to the window. For 4 days the cat sat on the sill above the fire escape, the one that connected to the apartment next door, and stared at the gap as if waiting for it to open. 4 days he meowed at the glass. 4 days Brianna pretended not to understand exactly how he felt. "He's not coming, you traitor," she told the cat, and then felt unfair because Everett had never been the one who left. She had. Twice. Her sister called every evening, the way sisters do when they've smelled a wound across hundreds of miles. "So let me make sure I understand," said her sister, on the 3rd call. "A man who is rich, kind, single, good with his hands, and apparently in love with you committed the unforgivable crime of being more impressive than he let on. He lied about who he was. He undersold himself. That's the rarest crime in the history of men." A pause. "Bree, what's actually going on? This isn't about him being famous." Brianna tucked her knees up on Gerald the bookshelf and was quiet for a while. "He didn't trust me," she said finally. "I told him the worst thing about myself, and he still didn't think I could handle the truth about him. And I keep thinking, what if everyone's right? What if I really am only good for the fun part? Even the best one thought so." "Or," her sister said gently, "a man who's been treated like a wallet his whole life finally found someone who didn't, and got so scared of losing it that he held on too tight in exactly the wrong way. Those can both be true, you know. He can have been wrong and it not be about you being less." Brianna didn't answer, but she didn't hang up either. Next door, Everett was not faring better, though he expressed it the way he expressed everything, in silence and in work. He had sent the actress's commission to the gallery finished and on time, and the woman had pronounced it the finest piece anyone had made for her, and he had felt absolutely nothing. He had also, in the same week, done something that made his lawyers call him 3 times. He'd cancelled 2 appearances, declined a magazine cover, and informed his assistant that going forward he would be taking far fewer commissions and far more quiet. The assistant had asked if he was all right. He'd said he was finally getting all right, which was a different thing. The building noticed his sadness the way the building noticed everything. Mrs. Okafor cornered him by the mailboxes. "You look terrible," she informed him. "Thank you. I'm not being kind, I'm being accurate. My late husband looked like that exactly once, the week he thought he'd lost me." She fixed him with a look that had buried opinions. "Quiet ones. You feel the loudest and say the least, and then you're surprised when nobody hears you." She pointed a finger toward him to emphasize her point. "She's not angry that you're somebody. She's angry that you decided who she was without asking, so are you going to stand here looking terrible, or are you going to do something only you can do?" Everett looked at the small, fierce woman who had appointed herself the conscience of the 3rd floor. "How did you know I can do something only I can do?" "Everybody can do something. Only they can do," she said. "That's the whole trick of being a person. Most just never bother." She patted his arm and went to harass someone else. He went back upstairs and worked. The cuff was nearly finished now. He had abandoned the cold perfection that made his name and worked instead the way he had on Brianna's grandmother's locket, slowly, by feel, letting the small flaws stay because the small flaws were where the life was. A solid band of warm gold, no stones, no tricks. And running around its surface, fine and almost too small to see unless you knew to look, the same pattern of leaves he'd found worn nearly to nothing inside her grandmother's locket. The leaves she'd forgotten were even there until he'd given them back. He thought about the audiobook she'd told him about weeks ago over burnt garlic. He has to hand her something only the real him could make, not an explanation. Anyone can explain. He thought about how he'd said, "I'm good at vaults," and how being a vault had cost him the one person he'd ever wanted to open all the way. When the cuff was done, he held it under the single lamp for a long time. It was, he knew without vanity, the best thing he had ever made. It would never appear in a magazine. No camera would ever photograph it. It was worth, in the only currency he now cared about, more than everything in his vault combined. Because it was the first piece in 20 years he'd made with his whole self instead of his reputation. But he didn't take it to her door. Not yet. A gift handed over in person could be refused to your face, argued with, turned into one more conversation on his terms, and he was done with his terms. This had to be hers, to find, to open, to decide about alone, with no famous man standing there managing her reaction. So he found a small plain box, the kind that held no logo and made no promises. He set the cuff inside on a bed of plain cloth, and he sat down to write a note, which took him longer than the cuff had, because Everett Kingsley had spent his life letting objects speak for him and had never been any good with words at all. In the end, he wrote only one line, the truest one he had. He looked at it a long time, then closed the box. He would leave it at her door in the morning, before either of them was awake enough to perform, and then it would be hers. The choice, the door, all of it. For the first time he would hand her something and not stand there to control what happened next. It was, he realized, the most frightening thing he had ever done. More frightening than any camera. He set the small plain box by his own door ready, and did not sleep at all. She almost stepped on it. Brianna opened her door at 7, bleary, looking for the cat who had escaped to the hallway again, and there on her welcome mat sat a small plain box. No logo, no crest, no silver letters, just brown cardboard and a folded note, the kind of package that promised nothing and therefore could break your heart in any direction it liked. She knew who it was from. There was only one person it could be from. She stood looking at it for a full minute before she picked it up. Inside, on a bed of plain white cloth, lay a band of gold. It was nothing like the things on the crates. There were no jewels in it, no flash, nothing that announced its price. It was simply a cuff, warm and solid and quiet, the kind of thing you could wear every single day of an ordinary life. She lifted it out, and it had a weight to it that the $4 necklace had taught her to recognize. The weight of something made to last, something with no tricks in it, nothing that would yellow or bend or fail. And then she turned it toward the light, and she saw the leaves. They ran all the way around the band, fine and small and almost hidden, the kind of detail you'd only notice if you were looking very closely, if you were the sort of person who noticed things. Leaves. The exact pattern, worn nearly to nothing, that he had coaxed back to life inside her grandmother's locket. The leaves she'd forgotten existed until he'd handed them back to her. He had taken the one small, private thing that mattered most to her, the thing no magazine and no actress and no crate would ever know about, and he had carried it into his own work and made it the heart of the most beautiful thing she'd ever held. He hadn't made her something to impress her. He'd made her something that proved he'd been paying attention all along, to her, to the real version, the serious version, the one nobody picked. Her hand was unsteady when she unfolded the note. One line. His handwriting, careful as his hands. The most precious things are the ones that don't shine on the outside. She sat down right there on the hallway floor, in the spot where they'd once waited out a locked door together, and she pressed the cuff and the note to her chest and let herself feel all of it at once. The hurt and the missing him and the slow, overwhelming understanding of what he was actually saying. He wasn't asking her to be impressed by who he was. He was telling her that the famous one, the one on the crates, that man shined on the outside and it had never made him happy or known or loved. The precious thing was the one underneath, the man who couldn't cook, the one only she had ever bothered to see. He was handing her that man, not explaining him, not defending him, just giving him and letting her decide alone, with no one standing over her, managing her face. For the first time, he'd trusted her with the choice. Pretzel found her there and climbed into her lap, and she sat with the cat and the cuff and the one true line for a long time. She thought about her sister's words. He can have been wrong, and it not be about you being less. She thought about a candle in a jam jar, and a man saying, "I'd pick you for the long version," and how she'd run from it because being chosen had frightened her more than being overlooked ever had. She had her own cowardice to account for. She'd walked out of a diner rather than stay in a hard conversation. Twice now she'd been the one who left. She slipped the cuff onto her wrist. It fit. Of course it fit. He noticed things. Then she stood up, set Pretzel gently aside, and walked the few steps across the hall that had somehow become the longest distance in her life. She stood in front of his door, the door she used to open without knocking, back when not knocking was their whole quiet agreement, and she understood that those easy days were a thing they'd have to earn back now, on purpose, with words instead of habits. She lifted her hand. She knocked. There was a long silence. Then footsteps, quick and then careful, and the door opened and there he was. The man from the candlelight, not the man from the crates, in a plain shirt with shadows under his eyes that said he hadn't slept any better than she had. He saw the cuff on her wrist. Something moved across his face that she had no word for, except that she'd waited her whole life to have someone look at her like that. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The hallway smelled of coffee and someone's burnt toast. A bicycle leaned against the radiator. It was the most ordinary place in the world, and it was theirs. "You made the leaves," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "I notice things," he said. "It's the one thing I'm genuinely good at." A breath. "I should have trusted you with the rest. I was a coward. And you were right about all of it. And I will spend as long as it takes proving I learned it." "I left," she said. "Twice. You're not the only coward on this floor." The corner of his mouth moved the way it did. "We could be cowards together," he said. "It's less lonely." She looked down at the cuff, at the leaves, at the one true line still folded in her other hand. Then she looked up at him, and she asked the question she'd come across the hall to ask. The only one that mattered now, the one she'd been too scared to let herself want. "Could we start over?" she said. "From the beginning, and just see where it goes?" And for the first time since the crates and the cameras and the careful, costly silence, Everett Kingsley smiled all the way. "I was waiting for you to say that," he said. The words came out rough, like they'd been sitting in him for days waiting for the door to open. He didn't move at first. He stood in the doorway and looked at her standing in the hall with the cuff on her wrist and her grandmother's leaves circling it, and he seemed almost afraid to believe the question was real. "You don't have to forgive the famous part all at once," he said. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for the beginning, for the chance to do it right this time, to be the man who couldn't cook, except honest about everything else." "The man who couldn't cook is the only one I ever wanted," she said. I just need him to stop deciding things about me without asking. I'm done deciding things about you. He said it like a vow, plainly, the way he said the truest things. From now on, I'll just ask. I'll probably ask too much. I've got years of not asking to make up for. She laughed, and it broke something open in both of them, the tightness of the last terrible week giving way all at once. And then she stepped across the threshold she'd crossed 100 times before, except this time it meant everything, and she paused close to him as the laugh faded into something quieter and far more serious. "Then ask me something," she whispered. "Can I—" He didn't finish in words. He didn't need to. He didn't finish in words, he didn't need to. His hands rose gently with the same care that had repaired kingdoms, and a $4 necklace. And he kissed her. The hallway went away. The whole noisy world of crates and cameras and lists she'd never been on simply stopped existing. And there was only this, the slow, certain meeting of two people who had spent weeks circling the truth and had finally landed in it. Time, which had been rushing past them in trains and appointments and missed tomorrows, went still and generous, as if it had decided to give them back every moment they'd wasted being afraid. She felt, in the steady comfort of his presence, the thing she had been waiting her whole life to feel and had stopped believing she would. She felt chosen, not for the fun, not for the party, for all of it, for the long version. When they finally drew apart, he kept his gaze close to hers and neither of them spoke, because some silences don't need filling. He taught her that on a rooftop, a lifetime ago. "I have to tell you the rest now," he murmured. "All of it. The real name. The whole ridiculous life. No more Vault." "Tomorrow," she said, smiling. "You can tell me your long stories all the way to the end tomorrow. We've got time." She rested her hand against his chest. "Right now I just want the man in front of me." He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had walked into his hidden life by spilling coffee on his coat and had seen him more clearly in a month than the world had in 20 years. Then he stepped back, guiding the way inside, and the door of the bare little apartment closed behind them with a soft and final click. What happened after belonged only to them. It was not loud or rushed. It was the unhurried tenderness of two people who had stopped performing, who had nothing left to hide and no one left to be but themselves. There was a kind of homecoming in it, the feeling of a thing long delayed finally arriving exactly when it was meant to. The single lamp glowed warm and low. Somewhere on the windowsill, a grey cat kept a disinterested watch over a city that knew nothing about the two people who, for the first time, had stopped being lonely in it. The night was theirs. Without pressure, without fear, without a single interruption, only the deep and certain comfort of having been at last completely seen. When morning came, light spilled through the curtainless window and laid itself across the bare floor, and Everett woke before her, the way he always woke before everyone. He did not reach for his phone. He did not turn his watch face inward. He lay still and watched the woman beside him sleep, her hand resting open on the blanket, the gold cuff still circling her wrist, the leaves catching the early light. He had made beautiful things his whole life. None of them had ever made him feel like this. Like the most valuable thing in the room was not anything he could hold under a loupe, but the simple, impossible fact of someone choosing to stay. She stirred. Her eyes opened, found him watching, and instead of the careful distance he'd spent years bracing for, she smiled, slow and unguarded, a smile with no audience in it at all. "You're staring," she mumbled. "I notice things. Creepy. Keep doing it." She stretched and her gaze fell on the cuff and her face softened all over again. "I'm never taking this off, you know. You're going to have to make peace with that." "Good," he said. "I made it to be worn every day, not looked at. Worn." He paused, and something shy crossed his face, an expression that did not belong to a man the world considered untouchable. "There's something I've wanted to say since I woke up. I've been practicing it. I'm bad at words, so don't laugh." "I will absolutely laugh. It's who I am." But she pushed herself up onto one elbow, and her eyes were bright, and she waited. He looked at her, gathering it, this man who had let objects speak for him his entire life, finally choosing to speak for himself. "I want you with me," Everett said. "Not just today. Always." The morning light held still around them. Brianna had been ready to laugh, the way she'd warned him she would, but the laugh didn't come because there was nothing funny in his face, only a man who had spent his whole life guarding himself, holding the door open at last. "I spent 20 years making things people wanted to own," he went on, the words careful and unrehearsed at once. "And the first time I ever wanted to belong to someone was the morning a woman ruined my coat and didn't know my name. I don't want to be your mysterious neighbor. I don't want to be the man on the crates. I just want to be the one across the hall, for as long as you'll have me." He paused. "Will you be mine? Properly? The two of us, the long version, all of it." For once in her life, Brianna had no words at all. She answered the way he would have, without filling the silence, without a single clever line. She simply leaned across the small space between them and kissed him, and that was the whole of her answer, and it was more than enough. "Was that a yes?" he murmured against her smile. "That was a yes, you impossible man." She pulled back, eyes shining. "On one condition. You never cook again. I've seen you near a stove. I'm protecting our future." "Agreed," he said gravely, "on the condition that you never name furniture again. Gerald is family. Gerald stays." "Then we have our first compromise," he said, and kissed her again, and the grey cat on the windowsill turned its back on both of them with the dignity of a creature who had known how this would end all along. They did start over that day, the way she'd asked. They began at the beginning, in a hallway that smelled of someone's dinner, two people learning each other on purpose this time. He told her his long stories all the way to the end, the foolish ring in the heating vent, the cameras he'd come to dread, the empty brilliance of a life spent impressing strangers. She told him hers. And somewhere in the telling, the famous one and the disaster from apartment 4 quietly stopped being two separate people and became simply a couple the whole building had predicted from the start. Mrs. Okafor took full credit. She had earned it. 2 years later, the apartment was a memory and the house was full of light. It was bigger now, with real curtains and a garden she was slowly killing with love. And it smelled, on this particular afternoon, of something faintly scorched, because Brianna was still Brianna, and the cake in the oven had made its own decisions. Everett, passing through the kitchen, did not say a word about the smell. He only smiled, the way he had learned to smile all the way. On the counter sat a small velvet tray, and on the tray, in progress, lay the tiniest pieces he had ever attempted. A little bracelet sized for a wrist that did not yet exist in the world. "For practice," he kept telling everyone, in the same unconvincing voice he'd once used to call himself a handyman. Nobody believed him. He didn't really want them to. She came into the room slowly, one hand resting at the base of her back, the other on the curve of a belly 7 months round, and she was, he thought, watching her cross the warm and ordinary kitchen, the most beautiful thing he had ever been allowed to look at. And he had looked at beautiful things for a living. "You're staring again," she said. "I notice things." He crossed to her and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then crouched without any self-consciousness at all to rest his hand against the swell of the baby. "Both of you. I'm the size of the building. You're radiant," he said. "There's a difference. I'm an expert in things that shine. You're not shining on the outside." He looked up at her, and there it was, the leaves coming full circle. "You're the other kind, the precious kind." She rolled her eyes to keep from getting weepy, which had become her whole strategy lately. On her wrist, worn smooth now from 2 years of every single day, the gold cuff caught the light, its small leaves softened by time. She wore it constantly, exactly as he'd made it to be worn. She'd been right, she'd never taken it off. The baby chose that moment to kick hard against his palm. Everett went very still. Then his whole composed face cracked straight down the middle into something helpless and bright. The look of a man who had received, with no warning, the only prize that had ever truly mattered to him. "Did you feel that?" he said, wonder-struck, as if she could possibly have missed it. "I feel it at 3 in the morning, careful hands." He laughed, holding them both close in a quiet embrace, and her gaze drifted, as it did most days now, to the small framed thing hanging on the wall above the doorway. It was not the cuff. It was not anything he'd made for an actress or a coronation or a magazine cover. It was the $4 necklace, the cheap junk total disaster little chain she'd handed a stranger, on her first day at Maple Court, and asked him to fix because he seemed like the type. He'd kept it after he restored it, all this time, and he'd had it framed, and he'd hung it where they would both pass under it every day. The least valuable object in the house, in the only place of honor. Whenever anyone asked about it, and people always asked expecting a story about diamonds, he gave the same answer, the one line he'd written on a plain note and slipped beneath her door on the morning that changed everything. The most precious things are the ones that don't shine on the outside. He'd believed it his whole career and never once lived it. It had taken a spilled coffee, a locked hallway, a bookshelf named Gerald, and a woman who didn't know who he was to teach him what he'd been carving into other people's jewelry for 20 years without understanding a word of it. The cake, by now, was beyond saving. Neither of them moved to rescue it. "We should probably deal with that," Brianna said, not moving. "In a minute," said the most private man in the jewelry world, who had finally, completely, stopped wanting to disappear. "I'm busy." And they stayed like that a while longer in the scorched and sunlit kitchen, the famous and the funny, the careful and the chaos, two neighbors who had met by accident in the most ordinary place in the world and decided on purpose to never live across the hall from each other again. Outside somewhere the world still waited on his name. Inside, under a framed $4 necklace, he had everything it had never been able to give him. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.